Hey y'all, hopefully you can hear me. Welcome to a quick and dirty overview of the literary elements of plot and character. You guys know I like visual representations of concepts, and so that's why I've got our little yin-yang up here. I also like rabbits, so that's why it's a rabbit one. The reason I picked that is because really the elements of plot and character in literature really, they can't be separated from each other. They are separate, they are distinct, but they also contribute to each other so fundamentally that it's kind of like a yin-yang situation. Plot drives character analysis, and of course what the characters do drives the plot. So it's an interesting back and forth dynamic. So here we go, starting with plot. So for a story to be a story, something needs to be happening. Otherwise, it's kind of like, what's the point? Why are we even reading this? So that's what plot is all about. It is the series of events which occur over the course of a story. You can't just have one event happen. That doth not a story make. It is a series of events which occur. So plot is defined really as the author's selection and arrangement of those events, those actions throughout the story. Which is harder than it sounds because, as we've discussed, we need stories for them to be enjoyable. We need them to at least be somewhat realistic. So the way those events are arranged has to sort of follow, for the most part, a lot of the laws of reality that we adhere to. So things like consequences, cause and effect, things like that. So we'll talk more about that in just a second. But plot has a very important purpose for a story. It gives shape to the story, gives it a sense of focus, and also purpose. There's some sort of end goal, end result that is being worked toward, and that's what plot's all about, and it kind of gives us a reason for following the story in the first place. Gives us a focus as well. Okay. All right, verisimilitude. There's that big fancy word again. We've talked a little bit about this. It's basically the recreation, well, not the recreation of, but the appearance of reality. Right? It's a fake. It's the recreation as best as we can of reality, which is what good storytelling tries to do. Like you guys pointed out, realism is really important. We want it to be relatable. We want it to be at least somewhat realistic, and that's what the appeal is. Otherwise, we really can't forget that it's not real. And that's really the whole enjoyable part of storytelling in the first place, is to lose ourselves in the narrative. So, again, plot has to follow a lot of the rules that we follow, such as cause and effect, things like consequences. What characters do or choose not to do, fail to do in a story will have consequences, just like it does in real life for you guys, both for themselves but also for other characters as well, and perhaps even the environment they're a part of. So when we talk about plot, when we analyze plot in a story, we really don't spend much time talking about the what, like what happened, the plot summary, so to speak. Really, the bigger, better, broader questions that we focus on are the how and the why. How the events happened the way they did, and why. Why one thing led to another, what the chain reaction, I guess you could say, would be, and how we end up, or how the characters end up where they are at the end, right? Why things happen the way they did. That's really what we're more interested in when it comes to analyzing plot, not so much the what. Okay, conflict. So another thing a story needs to be a good story, or a story at all really, is some kind of conflict. And conflict, as your textbook describes it, is a struggle between opposing forces. Okay? This is where the interesting parts come in. As much as we may root for a character, it's really boring to see that character do nothing, really, to have nothing to struggle against, to get everything he or she wants, to have no obstacles whatsoever they need to overcome. And really, how can you get to know a character unless you watch them struggle their way through situations? So conflict can come from a variety of places, external and internal. External being conflicts that come from outside the character, so things like just pure bad luck. It's not the character's fault necessarily, it's just, bad day. same thing that happens to you guys sometimes. Try as you might, plan as you might, sometimes you just get dealt a bad hand, either for the day or, hopefully not life, but sometimes that's true for characters. And it's not really their fault, but nonetheless. Interference from another character, that can create conflict as well. And that character might be ill-meaning, like actually trying to create conflict for the other character, or they might actually be innocent. They might not have any, reason whatsoever to try to hurt a character. Just by accident, they cause conflict for them. So either way, the results are still pretty much the same. Conflict. The forces of nature can cause conflict as well. Just think about snow days and classes being canceled, for example. I know it doesn't seem like conflict for the student, but for the teacher, it certainly makes things a little bit trickier. So, we behave differently under different environmental circumstances, and sometimes they create conflicts. Whether it's the wilderness or whether it's something as simple as, who knows, frost on your windshield. Society in general can also be a source of conflict. We talked a little bit about culture and the way culture operates in our lives, really dictates a good bit of our lives. That's true for characters too. And just like in real life, when someone goes against the grain of what's considered socially acceptable or socially desirable, that can create conflict in real life. That's just kind of the price you pay sometimes for going against the grain. It's true for characters too. If they don't go with the flow of what society thinks is the right thing or desirable, then that can create conflict for them. So lots of sources of conflict coming outside of a character. But there can also be internal sources of conflict. Maybe the character creates his or her own conflict because of the choices that they make. Just like you, they make choices and those choices have consequences, like we said. Or maybe the character has conflicting impulses within himself or herself that is creating conflict, creating anxiety within them. Psychoanalysis is all about this kind of stuff, right? The ego and superego and the id constantly at war within us to act a certain way, and that can create a lot of anxiety. Whether you believe in it or not, there is some truth to the fact that we can feel two ways or more about things, and even if we know something might be the right thing to do, we might still not do it anyway. So characters can be the same way about that. They might be sort of torn, just like us. So a really interesting story will tend to have a lot of different sources of a conflict. They'll have conflict coming from both outside and inside the character, because too much of one or too much of the other can be really boring. Like, nobody wants to see a character just get hammered with bad luck and, just totally innocent. It's a lot more interesting to have a little bit of that, but also the characters being the sources of their own conflict too, just like in real life. Okay, let's talk structure. Let's talk classic plot diagram. Okay, so this is, among all the other stuff we're talking about here, something that you're going to need to do for the lit terms test. Okay, one of the things you're going to need to do for the test is label a plot diagram. So that's what we're going to do right now. So this is called the classic plot diagram because it's classic. Every Shakespeare play, for example, every Greek tragedy is going to follow this exact formula. It still comes up a lot. It works pretty well as far as structuring a story. So the beginning part of the classic plot structure is what's known as exposition. Exposition is basically the starting point in the story where we get some background information, we get some context on the characters, who they are, where they are, when they are, maybe what happened before the story began, just to kind of get the reader up to speed on everything that we need to know before heading into the initial conflict. Okay. Because we need conflict to get the action going. So we usually put the inciting conflict, if you will, right there at the foot of the hill that'll kick the ball up the hill, so to speak. And then from there, that builds. We get a series of conflicts, one after the other, again, that kind of cause and effect relationship, and they build on each other, and that's what's known as the rising action. And the tension builds and builds, and we get more and more conflict, eventually leading to the crisis point. The crisis point is the point of no return. Things are coming to a full boil. The tensions are building. It's a really tense moment, and there's really no turning. Excuse me. There's really no turning back. Excuse me. Got a frog in my throat. There's no turning back at this point, and all of that is really heading toward the climax, right? The big kaboom moment that the whole story is really building up to. It is the moment of greatest tension. It's when everything sort of boils over, comes to a head, explodes, if you will. That's really the thing we've been kind of working toward. But typically stories don't end there at the climax. Instead, you'll have this big kaboom moment, but then we need to kind of come down from that. And that's when we get what's known as the falling action. Okay? There's still action going on, but it's definitely a lot tamer than what we had at the climax. So the story's not over. There's still a few, loose ends to wrap up, a few things that happen, and then all of that sort of works its way to resolution. Which that's the part, depending on who you are and what you like. This is usually, people need this. They want to feel like all the questions have been answered, all the loose ends have been tied up, all the mysteries have been solved. So I guess a good example maybe of this kind of plot structure and action would be a show like Law and Order. Law and Order, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you haven't, it pretty much follows this exact same structure every single episode. They're all good, don't get me wrong, but it's good TV. But it follows this pretty closely. We usually start out with some kind of, we start out with a corpse, basically. And then the rest of the episode is all about, okay, how, who killed this person, who done it, sort of thing. And all of that leads up to the climax. The climax being when the guilty party is finally discovered, and usually as soon as they're discovered and pressed even just a little bit, they completely fall apart and confess, and I did it, I killed her, kind of a thing. We get our climax there, and it's shocking, whatever, because it's usually the person you least expect. But we're not done there. We've got to come down from that. So there's usually, with the falling action, you get maybe the person being convicted, maybe the trial, that kind of a thing, convicting the person, and then at the end, you get the detectives who are working on the case, kind of hanging out and talking, kind of reflecting back on the course of the episode, and that's really our resolution, right? Kind of what they learned, what we're supposed to take away, the bigger lessons, all that kind of thing. Now, with that said, not all stories follow this classic formula. A lot of stories do, still to this day, and some of the stories that we've read so far for this class has followed that structure pretty closely. But not everything we're going to read will, and not everything that you'll see in TV and movies does either. The reason being that a lot of authors, story writers, script writers, whatever, consider that a little bit too cliche, overdone, tired, overused, and predictable. They don't think it's as fun when everybody knows, okay, this is what we're all gonna. It's gonna build to a climactic point, and then we're gonna have some sort of resolution. Not all storytellers like that. They want to try something a little bit different. So what some do instead is they do a technique what's known as in medias res, which is Latin for in the midst of things. So instead of starting at the beginning with some exposition and kind of getting everybody up to speed, they will toss you right into the middle of the action and then basically catch you up from there. Okay, so picture a war movie maybe with you got some soldier and he's in the trenches and he's being bombed and bombarded and stuff like that, and we don't know who this guy is or what's going on really, even maybe what side he's fighting on necessarily. But then we have a series of flashbacks. Flashbacks are basically when we get scenes from the past inserted into the present, or having the events told out of order, right? Not in chronological order. So filling in the blanks as we go. So in the example I was just given of the war movie, maybe we get flashbacks of the guy's life before he went overseas to fight, his family, who he left behind, what his job was, basically painting the picture of who this guy is as we go, leading up to the moment we find him fighting. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Oh, and some stories start at the end and fill the blanks in as they go. One of the stories we're going to read for this class, Rose for Emily, actually starts when she dies. It starts on the day of her funeral, and then the narrator sort of fills us in on who she was and the details of her life as we go from there, but they're actually not told in chronological order, which makes it kind of tricky to keep up with, but I think that part's fun. Other plot devices that you need to know. Suspense. You guys said when we talked about what makes a good story is the need for suspense. Suspense is that it's a good feeling. It's a good and bad feeling. It's the edge of your seat feeling. It's a pleasurable, exciting form of anxiety that comes from uncertainty about what's going to happen. Suspense is a good thing, as you guys pointed out last time, because it's really not fun to be able to predict what's going to happen next every step along the way, because then it's like, okay, what's the point? Why are you still watching or reading or whatever, right? We want to turn the page or keep on watching so that we can find out. So it's that uncertainty that, I guess, strings us along. And good storytelling it's a tricky tightrope walk between uncertainty and familiarity, because, like we said, we want realism, we want it to seem relatable, but if it's too relatable, if it's too familiar, then it's not as good. If we can't, but on the flip side, if we're totally confused the whole time and we just can't keep a bead on anything, we can't really make any predictions about what's going to happen, then that's that doesn't compel us either. So good stories are, like I said, a tightrope walk between uncertainty and familiarity. That's what we like. That's good storytelling. Foreshadowing. So one thing an author will do to create suspense is he or she will toss in the occasional instance of foreshadowing, which, as the name sort of betrays, it's not a good thing. I mean, it's good storytelling, but it's not good for the characters, because these are symbolic clues and they suggest a negative outcome for the characters. They suggest that something bad is going to happen later on down the line. And they can be pretty subtle. They usually are pretty subtle. A not so subtle example would be, if, let's say a character's walking down the street and he sees a hearse drive by with a coffin in the back. Okay, that's not a very subtle example of foreshadowing, but usually when something like that happens, it's like, oh shoot, this isn't good. So keep an eye out for that in stories, particularly Flannery O'Connor's stories. She's the author of Good Man is Hard to Find and Good Country People, because she loves her some foreshadowing. She loves throwing these in there, and they're pretty easy to miss because they're subtle if you don't look out for them, but they're definitely in there. So more plot devices. They just keep on coming. Okay, Deus Ex Machina. This is another Latin phrase. It literally means God out of the machine. Okay. The reason why it is called God out of the machine is that back during the times of Greek tragedies and such, a pretty common plot device that playwriters would use in the event that they painted themselves into a corner, so to speak, plot-wise, like they put their characters into a position where there's just really no way out. They're stuck. They can't move forward because they've just gotten themselves stuck. And the playwright just really can't come up with any sort of organic way to get them out of it under their own devices, their own steam. What the playwright would do is they would write in having like a god come in, like a Greek god, like Zeus, and they would just kind of out of nowhere, out of the blue, unprepared for. So as the description here says, it's improbable, it's unprepared for, it's a plot contrivance, right? It's contrived, it's kind of artificial. And it comes in late in the game, in the literary work, and it's there to resolve the conflict. So the playwright would like literally have them lower this actor down onto the stage using a crane, like he's flying in, like, a Greek god would do. And then he would, in a booming voice, I am Zeus, I'm here to save the day. So obviously we don't have much of that kind of stuff going on anymore in our storytelling, but we do still use the phrase to talk about any time in a story that just like kind of out of nowhere, a really convenient outside force comes in and really fixes everything for the characters because they can't do it themselves. So Maybe it's like aliens or, I don't know, a superhero or whatever. So, but it's kind of, the point is it kind of flies in out of nowhere, much like Zeus, to save the day. Nice and convenient. Most people kind of think of that as a cop-out these days, but you still see it every now and then. Epiphany. The epiphany. The epiphany is the sudden revelation of truth that a character has. It's the aha moment. And of course, the truth that is revealed to them really depends on the character, depends on the story, depends on what it is the character didn't know and needs to know by the end. And this revelation will usually come as the result of, so it's usually unexpected, right? I mean, it's always unexpected. Nobody ever expects an epiphany. But it almost always happens in the resolution of the story. That might be what the story's kind of working toward, is in the resolution, the character will it'll all come together for them, and they'll have this deep realization about themselves and about life and stuff like that. Which we've had a couple of characters so far that have had that have had epiphanies. Do you know who I'm talking about? Okay, along those lines, we've also got what are known as initiation or coming of age stories. This kind of feeds off of the whole epiphany plot device. These are stories where you have a character, and that character is usually young, right? Child, younger person. You don't really talk about adults coming of age because they've already come of age. And in this story, they learn some sort of important, life-altering truth about the way the universe works, about the way society works, about the way people work, about themselves that they didn't have before. And in doing so, they become less naive and just really all around more mature, I guess. So not every character that has an epiphany is part of a coming of age story. The X factor here is youth. If you have a character that is young, is a child, and has some sort of epiphany, then you're dealing with a coming of age story. And yes, that is one of the mythological archetypes. So, moving on to character. Okay, like I said, plot and character really goes hand in hand. You really can't have one without the other, because someone's got to make the plot happen. The plot can't happen in a vacuum. It has to be enacted by characters. So, a character is defined as an imaginary personage who acts, appears, or is referred to in a literary work, which is a pretty stodgy way to think about it. But the imaginary part is important because, again, we're going for realism here in a way. We want to kind of forget that the character is not a real person, because if they seem to fake, then we really can't, or like flat or one-dimensional, then we really can't relate to them, and we can't really care about them so much. So that's where the process of characterization comes into play. Right? This is the process by which an author makes a character seem real to the reader. Okay? We'll talk in just a second about how an author can go about doing something like that. Okay, characterization clues. These are the things that we need to look for when we are analyzing the element of character in a story and how an author can sort of sculpt or build a character over the course of the story. This is a picture of Bill Cosby that I really like. I don't know why. So we're going to use him as our character, okay? So how do we figure out how a character is built? Well, there are lots of different dimensions to a character, much like there are lots of different dimensions to you. And again, they need to adhere fairly closely to our expectations of real life. So of course we can look at what a character does over the course of the story, the actions that they take. That's a pretty big part of the equation. But there's also what they say as well, what they say to other characters. The dialogue throughout the story is pretty important. But whereas in real life, these two things, what people do and what they say, are really the only things we have, the only things we have access to, and sort of figuring out what makes a person tick, figuring out who they are. The fun thing about fiction that we can have access to that we don't have in real life is that a lot of times we will also have access to what a character thinks as well. And where it really gets interesting is when these things don't match. Because characters, just like real people, don't always say exactly what they're thinking. They might say one thing and think something totally different, because that's what real people do. We often don't say what we're thinking, and that's probably a good thing. But the fun part about fiction is that we do have access to these thoughts, so we can really get a more complete picture of this character, who they are, what motivates them, maybe even how honest or dishonest they are. Okay, character types. There are different types of characters. Let's start with stock characters. Stock characters, you guys see them all the time. They are types. They come up over and over and over again in literary works, but also movies, TV shows, things like that. So we've actually talked about a few of these already. Archetypes fall pretty closely along the lines of these. So like the hero, for example, the virtuous hero, the damsel in distress, the evil villain, the trusty sidekick, the mad scientist. These would all be examples of stock characters. There's tons of them, and they still come up all the time. And the thing about stock characters is that they don't really have to be developed so much because we already know them. We've known them our whole lives. We've grown up really with these characters, so we don't really need a lot in the way of development, and we really don't need to spend a lot of time talking about their motivations for why they do what they do, because their characters sort of dictate what they do. So like the virtuous hero, what makes him so heroic? Well, because he's virtuous, and that's, he really doesn't have a choice in the matter. So these are pretty one-dimensional characters. They do pretty much exactly what you expect they're going to do. They're kind of predictable in that way. And they don't really have motivations beyond just that's what they're supposed to do. So, okay, moving on to character types. The protagonist versus the antagonist. All right, the protagonist. This is our main character in the story, and you really only ever get one protagonist. I really can't think of, maybe TV show. With TV shows, you get more than one protagonist, but usually in stories, like shorts, like literature or in movies, you typically only get one main character. Now, this is not the same as a hero or heroine, if we're being good feminists. So, like Dorothy, for example, she's pretty heroic. She's a heroine. It's not the same though, because a hero or heroine, these characters are, like we said, virtuous, and they're supposed to elicit our sympathy. We kind of have to root for them. They're larger than life. They're admirable, really. And a protagonist may not be admirable or even likable at all. It doesn't matter though. They're still our main character whether we like it or not. So, the antagonist. The job of the antagonist. This is the character that is basically there to cause conflict for the protagonist. However, an antagonist can take a lot of different forms. Now, of course, it can be another character. So in the picture we've got Dorothy versus the Wicked Witch. So her antagonist is pretty clearly another character in this situation. Again, that character might be ill-meaning, like our Wicked Witch here, or she might not be. She might actually just, be trying to do her own thing, and it just doesn't jive with what the protagonist is trying to do. Either way, it still causes conflict. Society. Like we said, society can be a source of conflict in a story, so society can really be the antagonist at work here that the protagonist is struggling against. The forces of nature can act as an antagonist as well. I mean, you may only really have one character in a story, no other characters around, but if the protagonist is battling against the forces of nature, trying to survive in extreme circumstances, then that makes nature the antagonist. Or, like we said, sometimes conflict can be internal, and so the protagonist himself or herself can really be the source of his or her own conflict, can really be his or her own worst enemy. Round versus flat. Round versus flat. Okay, so characters usually come in two forms. They can either be round characters or they can be flat characters. Round characters are complex. They are multifaceted, meaning they have many sides to them, good and bad. positive and negative, desirable, undesirable. And the thing about round characters is that they don't always necessarily do what we expect them to do. With stock characters, like we said, you can pretty much map out exactly what those characters are going to do because that's what they always do. Round characters can surprise you. They can act in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect, but once it happens, you at least accept that it's possible because they seem, I guess, a little bit more autonomous than stock characters would be. So, yeah. Round characters. Those are the ones that are a little bit more interesting and worthy of analysis. Flat characters, on the other hand, are relatively simple. Not all characters in a story can be round. I mean, there's really just not enough room for that, and there's really no need for it anyway. The flat characters are there to, I guess, sort of provide something or someone for the round characters to interact with. But they're pretty simple. They have few dominant traits. We learn a few things about them, but not a lot. We don't really need to, though. We don't need a ton of information about these characters. And they tend to be pretty predictable. They don't really go against our expectations very much. And but again, they're really there for the round characters. I mean, we would notice if they weren't there. It would change the story if they weren't there. They certainly have a function, an important one, but there's not a lot to them, and we don't really need there to be. So as you can probably imagine, the protagonist in the story is going to be round. Static versus dynamic. Okay. Again, so you can have a character that's either round or flat. You can also have a character that's either static or dynamic. Okay, so think about it like science right now. Think about physics. If something is static, it doesn't change. Yes, very good. So smart. Static characters don't change at all. They are pretty much the same at the end of the story as they were at the beginning. They don't learn anything as a result of what took place in the story, and there's really no real consequences for them as a result of anything that happens in the story. It really didn't impact them in any significant way. They're, like I said, they pretty much come out the end of the chute the same way they went in. We still need them because not everybody can have, life-altering consequences for what goes on in these stories. That wouldn't really make sense. But yeah, they don't really change. Dynamic characters, on the other hand, change. Really, that's what it's all about. Following them through the course of the story to see how they change, in what ways they change, how they're different at the end than they were at the beginning, and to talk about how and why that change took place. They might learn something as a result of these changes. Maybe that's the change they underwent. Maybe they don't. They might grow. It might be a positive change. They might grow as a result of what happened, or it might be a bad change. They might actually deteriorate by the end. They might have started out okay, but are not okay by the end. These characters undergo major consequences as a result of what occurs, what they do, what's done to them. They are not the same by the end. They change. Okay, so as you can imagine too, the protagonist is dynamic because that's what it's all about, watching how the protagonist undergoes changes throughout the course of the story. The anti-hero. Okay, we're rounding the corner here, y'all. The anti-hero. This character is an interesting type, and there are more and more anti-hero characters coming up all the time. It has become a very popular trope in storytelling. People love anti-heroes. So what are they? Anti-hero is a protagonist who is, in one way or another, the very opposite of a traditional hero. Okay? They're an anti-hero. They're the opposite of a hero. They lack one or more of the typical characteristics that a hero possesses. So when we think hero, we think things like virtue, a strong sense of morality, what's right and wrong. They always do the right thing. Bravery, that's an important part of heroism as well, right? Putting your life on the line, putting yourself on the line, putting yourself out there to help others. Selflessness, right? This dedicating oneself to a cause, a quest of some kind to help others. like the heroes you typically have a sense of purpose too. They have some sort of reason for going out and getting things done. They have a purpose. They're purposeful, and they're strong. They're typically strong, and they use their strength for virtuous ends, right? So all of that kind of rolls together to create what we typically think of as a hero. Now, an anti-hero is, again, lacks one or more of these things. So maybe this anti-hero might, be virtuous and be brave and whatever, but maybe they're, wimp. I mean, they're a wimp. They don't have any strength. Or maybe this character's totally selfish and self-centered. Maybe this character, is just kind of floating through life, just scraping by, doesn't really have a sense of purpose at all. Maybe he's a coward. Maybe she's a coward. Who knows? But people love anti-heroes because I don't know why. That's an interesting question of why people like anti-heroes so much. But there's tons of them out there on TV. Let's think. Breaking Bad. The main character from Breaking Bad, Walter White, is a classic anti-hero. I've never watched House, but a lot of people say that he's very an anti-hero. Dexter, same deal. I haven't watched that, but people say he's pretty anti-heroic. There's tons of them. I'm sure you're probably thinking of like 8 right now, and you'll see them all the time. If you're not, you'll start seeing them everywhere for sure. But one thing's for certain, people like them, and they make for good storytelling. They're interesting, and who knows? Maybe they might even start out heroic or with good intentions and become more and more anti-heroic over the course of the story. It's kind of the idea. Oh, and of course we got our little pirate guy over here. So I think I put that because I was thinking of what's his name from Pirates of the Caribbean, Jack Sparrow. Yeah, Jack Sparrow is definitely an anti-hero. He has his good moments, but he definitely is. He's a pirate through and through, and everybody loves him for it. So, okay, well, that wraps up our quick and dirty overview of plot and character. All the stuff that was in quotation marks those are word-for-word definitions taken out of the glossary from the back of your anthology textbook. The stuff that is not is me. And if it's bolded, then it's a literary term that you need to know for the test. And I'm going to go ahead and put the slides up as well. But I thought I'd do this as a video so that I could fill in the gaps as we go. So I'll see you guys later. Thanks for watching.